Tonight, we're lucky to have Kent with us. Kent is going to present his approach to using a method to speed up data entry when you have massive amounts of selections. Generally speaking, I prefer to have presenters introduce themselves and give us a little bit about their own background. And that way I know we're getting the true stuff instead of my faulty memory. So go ahead, Kent, if you'll introduce yourself and your presentation, we're on.
All right. Well, I started in software 30 years ago. I was actually in retail, and at the time trying to find a good point of sale retail system, and I came across one that looked fantastic and it was well designed, poorly implemented, full of bugs and what have you. And but after I sold my retail store, I went to work for them and started sorting them out, being primarily a business analyst, but then sort of taking over the quality control and then eventually took over managing the development department. So to manage the support and then development, I decided we needed a piece of software to do that, which I wrote in Access. And that went all quite swimmingly. But of course, when you're writing software for developers and you don't get it quite right, they quickly let you know. So I learned very rapidly about indexes and all that sort of thing. And so that was back in early mid-90s, yeah. And so I've been playing around with Access since I was version 2 or something, I don't know. Anyhow, so these days I've got a handful of good clients, and I work entirely for small businesses, and wherever possible, I'm dealing direct with the owners because that's much easier to get decisions. Anyhow, and you're speaking about APIs. I did a API to interface one of a big application I'm doing with Xero's accounting, and that was an interesting process. So that's maybe something we could talk about in the future as to how to connect to that accounting API. Anyhow, in this example, we're looking at a situation where, and this will be on my website, which George will post a link to, where I've had many clients, well, a few clients over the years, but one major one at the moment, who does fixtures and fittings for buildings, commercial buildings like, you know, hospitals and prisons and what have you. But this one's sort of a mini example of fitting out rooms in a hotel. And when you're doing that sort of thing, you're kind of working out all the fixtures and fittings that are going into each room. So this is an example of doing that. Now, often, particularly when you're working as a sole developer, you don't always think of the multi-user issues that you're going to come across. So this is a good example of how to deal with that. Now, you'll notice here that we've got these little select checkboxes here. Now, to do a checkbox in a table, we'd normally just add a select column to the table. Well, the problem with that is if you've got two users trying to select the same thing at the same time, what have you, it all gets a bit tripping over each other. So let's give a little bit of an example of how to do this. Well, let's clear the list to begin with. Now, let's look at 3 examples where we've got a king room, a queen room, and a twin room. So quite often what we do is we create a template room and then we copy all the stuff from that room to all the other rooms of the same type in the building. So with a project like this, usually you get what's called a schedule of accommodation from the architect or the builder, where they give you a list of all the rooms that are in the building. So we've got this big list over here of all of these. Now, I've only got the bedrooms here. I haven't put in restaurants and all that sort of stuff. So we'll just have a look at this. Now we've got a template room, and then we can have another room where, well, let's delete everything out of that and go back to our template room, and we go, okay, we've got bed heads, we've got a fridge, mirrors, TV, that sort of stuff. All right, so let's select all of that. And as you can see over the right-hand side, we've got a list box that's got all of that. We can then go to this other room here and go, okay, add all that into this room. And if we go to our queen room and find one that's got everything we want in it, and we can go, okay, let's clear that list, select all of that, and go to another queen room and go, delete all that and start again. Add all that to the room. There we go.
Kent, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I do not understand the purpose of what you're doing right now.
Okay. So when you're planning the fitting out of a hotel, the architect gives us a list of all the rooms in that hotel, and then we have to create a list of what's going into each room, all the fixtures and fittings, so that we can then create purchase orders and manage all of that stuff that's going into those rooms in that hotel once the building's been completed.
So my assumption would be that there are multiple rooms with identical furniture.
Yeah.
And rather than do it one at a time, you can do it in bulk.
Yep. So typically you'd start off with nothing in any of these other rooms. And you might create a room template. And what else, what we might like in there? A chair and floor lamp. Oh, we've already got that. Yep. So, all right. So I'm happy with that as the fit out for our for a queen room. And that's what we're going to put into the other queen rooms. So at this point, we'll select all of that. And we go to our other queen room and we go, yep, all right, dump all of that in there. And this one, we can dump all of that in there. And we now have all of those rooms are getting the identical stuff. Then after having done that, we can then just go and say, well, I want to change that for a different something or other. But effectively, this is allowing us to add all the stuff from over here. Now, if we go to a room like this, that's got some of that stuff, and it doesn't have a bed. We need to add one of those. I blew that, didn't I? All right, so a bed, and I can add just the selected, or I can go being a multi-select list box. We can add the selected stuff there, or we can add everything. Now, you will notice that there is a composite unique index on rooms and items. Oh, Crystal, this will give you more of an idea of what's going on. If we come up here and we have a look at the ERD. We can see we've got items and we've got rooms. And then that subform is this one here where we've got the room items. So room item, which is what we've got here. Are we kind of getting the gist of it? Because I haven't probably explained it terribly well. It's kind of a bit too much second nature for me. Anyhow, the point is that
Can
we
we
can
go back
select
to the
these.
relationships diagram and, just explain?
I
what-
thought you'd like that, Crystal.
Thank you, Kent.
All right, so we've got rooms and we've got items that are going to go into those rooms. So the items going into the rooms, we've got this room item joining table.
And can you also like double click on a border of each of the field list to expand it? Okay, you can do that way too. But you can also go to a border. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, I know. Well, sometimes it's not
course you
easy
do.
getting them.
Okay, so I mean you have obviously a list of features that can be included, and then when you pick a room, you can like choose which of those things. I'm just a little confused, by the interface. I'm sorry, Kent. I just want to follow this better.
Okay. All right. So if we come over to, these are the items. Right. So as you can see here, if we clear the list, if we're going to fit out a king size room, we obviously want a bed of king size, and we want a bed high. I don't have a king size bed head. Oh, yes, we do. Down there. And we're going to probably want to put in a big TV. This is a king size room, the biggest TV we can get. I'm going to put one of those in there. And let's give them an ironing board and an iron. Did I do that? Yeah, there we go. All right. So that's a list of what we decided we want to put in a king size room. If we go over to here and we find our king room, if I spell it right, would be better. And let's delete everything out of that. Right, and this is what we've decided we're going to put in that king size room. And there it goes. With all the other ones, let's just pretend that they were already empty. And we can just add that to there. And we've decided we want something else in there. What else do we want? Oh, let's give them a large bar fridge. Right, so we want to add that into that room and that into that room. Now, here's where we get to the interesting bit. If we go back to our relationship diagrams, we'll see that this particular table here is where we're putting the selected items. So even though we're selecting items that are in this table here, that checkbox is actually that field there. So when we look at that list of items, we've got that select table and we've got the item table. Look at the budgies floating outside my window. And we've joined to that, and we're using the select column from here to display in that checkbox. Now, because this table here only has the selected items, it's not a column from the item table, and it's not a column from the from here or here. So if we have a look at what's in there, it's only the items we got selected. And this would typically be a front-end table, so we're not sharing it with other users. So the items I've selected isn't going to interfere with the items somebody else is selecting in another front end at the same time. Are we with me, or are we?
Yeah, that's great.
So now
All
you
right,
can,
so effectively, yeah.
so I'm going to say with this,
So when
you can replicate that. You've got 280 some rooms in this hotel. Once you have it set up, you can put it into 150 of them quickly.
yeah, you just go through them and hit the button and it adds them if it's not already there. Whereas normally you've got people going, oh, I want one of these. A floor lamp in this one, and I want, I've got to put a floor lamp in that one, and I've got to put a floor lamp in, which is just tedious. Whereas if I want to do it this way, if I add a floor lamp there, it's in my list over here, and I can go to any room, any other room, and go, well, maybe I can't because I haven't.
I have a question, Kent. So you have a front end table to make it easier for each user to customize their experience. But what happens when something gets booked with, various, specific attributes? Doesn't that then go into a back end table? Because wouldn't then everybody need to know about it?
Yeah, well, this table here, what's going on? Okay, so any of these tables that have got a TBL prefix, they would be in the back end. Okay, I'm working again. All right, so
Kent,
if we go back to
the template rooms, are they just exactly the same as any other room with just got a special title?
yeah, well, effectively what we've got here in this hotel are three types of bedrooms. There's a king room, queen room, and a twin room. Now, typically, they won't all be exactly the same. So your queen rooms will probably have pretty much the same stuff, but there can be slight variations.
Yeah, no, my question was, you
during
made the template that you're copying into other rooms, I think, but you have, correct me if I'm wrong, you haven't created any special structure for that template. It's just another room. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, good.
All right, so that with some projects, when you first get your brief from the client, they just say, we're going to want 20 king size rooms, 50 queen size rooms, and 50 twin rooms. And they don't have the individual rooms. It's just, we want 50 of these. So you go, all right, well, in each queen room, we're going to put this, in each king room, we're going to put this, in each twin room, we're going to put this, and that's about how much it's going to cost you. So that's in the quoting stage of putting a building together. Then when the architect actually designs it and they send you, and this usually comes out of Revit, AutoCAD or whatever, and you then get what's called a schedule of accommodation. And these are all the rooms in the buildings, and you get a list of all the individual rooms. And then you have to say, okay, I'm now going to populate each of these individual rooms. Now, the easiest way to do it is using this room quantity and saying, okay, I'm going to have 20 of these rooms, and you hit the button and it will create these other rooms. But we've already got our schedule of accommodation, so I'm going to do that. Let's go and do this.
Dumb question. Is this for planning what's going into the rooms, or is this for making the rooms ready when guests are going to check in? Because it seems like what you're showing here is planning the rooms.
That's correct. So we just built the hotel, and now we've got to put all the stuff in it. Now, why don't we go and blitz all of that? And now there's nothing in any of the rooms. So let's go and find ourselves a king size room. Let's go to that template. We add all the stuff to it. So we can just go through and do each room. And having done all that and populated each room with all that stuff, we can then produce our purchase orders to buy all the stuff. Because we just go, all right, gives the total of king size beds that we need, which will be 227. No, won't be. Be whatever that list is. Looks like, I don't know, about 30. So having populated all that, we can then produce a purchase order. And when everything arrives, the people on site can go to as the truck arrives, they can go, okay, I've got this many king size beds. Here's a list of each room that they need to go in. And then somebody comes around later with a report that says, okay, this is what should be in each room, and they tick them all off. And that's how the FF&E business works. So they do the planning of what's got to go into each room. They place the purchase orders, then they put the stuff in the room, and then they do a check to make sure it's all there, and then the hotel's ready to open.
What's FF&E?
Fixtures and fittings. Fixtures, fittings, and equipment, or something like that. But that's one of the disciplines. So
I have kind of a dumb question, I think. You have these numbers, this 1204, 1205. Are those real room numbers in the hotel, or are those just numbers that are in the table, the primary key?
no, they're not. No, they're room codes. So, for example, that could be
So, yeah.
But because in a hotel, you usually got a room number that starts with what level it's on.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be on level 12 or room 12th floor.
So those are.
And it's room number.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. I told you it was a dumb question. Now,
right. So if we look. Yeah, so we look back here, we've got the room ID, right, which is, of course, our auto number primary key. We've got the room code, which is what we're seeing there. And then the room name. Right, so we've kind of got the gist of what's going on there. Do we want to see how it's done?
Yes.
So-
Yeah,
So,
that's-
so what would you say is
nodding.
the main point of showing this to us?
Well, in a user, so this is all about being able to make a selection, like selecting a record in a multi-user environment, so you're not tripping over other users.
I also see, instead of having to go room by room and pick 5, 6, 7 items off a list, one at a time, you set up a standard room and say, I need the next 10 rooms to be exactly the same. And so instead of clicking the
Yep,
same
you can
items,
do it that way.
instead of clicking the same items
Yep.
20 times, 6, which is 120 clicks, you do 20 clicks plus the original 6, and you're done.
Yeah, you can do it that way, but often what happens is that at some point, right, we then want to add some more stuff. So we've now already populated our king room with that stuff, and then the client decides they want something else to go in there. When we come back here, we've now got a mirror that needs to be added. So we can either select that mirror and add it, or we can just hit add to room and it'll put everything that's in there. So we can, and when we go to the next room, we're going to add everything. But then at some point, some idiot's going to decide that they want something else in there. So we've got to come up here and we go, we want one of those in there too. All right, and over here we can now go, all right, let's do our kettle. But no, I don't want to put it in that room, but I do want to put it in this room. And believe me, this is the way these people work. You don't get sort of level of inconsistency that we as software developers would like to get, because it all gets a bit, this room needs a left-handed something. No, we're going to need, no, we don't want that bar fridge. We want a different one. And there are people who sit there and do this sort of stuff, just going over, the client wants to have a small fridge in this one, but a big fridge in this one. And God only knows why, but those are the decisions that are made. So in some cases, if you, like I said, if you get the original brief, which is, I want 30 king size rooms, you go, okay, this is what's going to go in your 30 king size rooms. And then you can propagate it out to the other rooms by just hitting a button. And that's one method of doing it. But in a lot of cases, they want to do it like individually and add, I want this one here and that one there. So this method of selection, but the selection of records can happen for any particular reason. Like you may decide that you want to, okay, I'm going to select these records for adding to a purchase order or whatever. But the problem you come up with is if all you do is add a select column to the item table or the room item table, and you've got 2 people working on the same project at the same time, you got them 2 people trying to select the same item or unselect the same item, and they go, I thought I just selected that. What happened to that? And it's because somebody else unselected it.
So
and everyone keeps tripping all over each other.
a question, Kent. Obviously, you've been working with hotels. So let's say they have like X number of king rooms do those king rooms have different rates depending on what's in them?
That can be a possibility. They can have a different rate because they're on the other side of the building and doesn't get as good a view. There's all sorts of weird stuff that happens. So just because they're all king rooms, that doesn't mean they're all going to be exactly the same. But they'll be roughly the same.
Ken, I don't see.
And there are other.
Kent?
But don't get caught up on the business rules for building a hotel, because it gets even more complicated when you start looking at other disciplines like lighting and acoustics, and you're talking about hospitals or prisons or whatever, where the variation between them can be quite a lot.
And it sounded like David was asking a question. Did you hear him interrupting?
No. Sorry, David, how are you?
How you doing, sir? And everyone else. My question, Ken, has to do with, I don't see what do you call it? A feel for pricing these fixtures. Is that someplace else in your database?
Oh, it could be. You just add that into the items table, but
that's
into that table there. But we're not interested in pricing at the moment. We're just interested in populating the rooms.
Well,
and this is a simplified example. So
okay,
you would actually put the price here. Although, I've had situations with clients, they want the price for the item in that particular room. And we go, why? Why would the king size bed cost different in this room to what it does in this room? Oh, but that's just the way we want to do it.
Yeah, it seems to me like that's a separate function.
Yeah.
Well, I would say if you
But the whole point of
rooms with the fixtures, then you need to know what the cost of each fixture is going to be.
That's somebody.
Not interested in that at this point in the project.
Somebody needs to know that.
Yeah, actually, I think what Kent is trying to show us is how to populate things quickly.
Yeah. I mean,
and specifically about how to work in a multi-user environment where you've got two people working on the same table.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, all right. So if, for example, if in the item table, I just put a selected column here and people were going in here and going, okay, I'll select this, select that. In the item table, you've got one person who's selected items here and another person who's selected different ones. And when you come over here and you hit the add room, I got a whole lot of stuff that I didn't select because somebody else did. This is not an issue that's ever come up.
I appreciate that point about your multi-user selection. So essentially what you're saying then, if I get to the nub of it, is that instead of doing the selection in the back end table, you've got a table in the front end that's unique to each user, and he can select or deselect without stepping on anybody else's toes.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
That's the key point. Yeah, I had years and years ago when I was working down in Portland, we had a client that did estimating. And that was a very common problem. They had 15 estimators working on, some of them on the same project, some of them on different projects. And this technique, if I had been smarter, I would have come up with this myself. But as it was very difficult to keep them from stepping on each other's estimates for that very reason. Because if the data is in a SQL server in the back end, one person says, I need 12 transformers, and the other person says, I need 8, who wins? Well, last choice wins. And this would have been a much cleaner way to solve that problem. Now, they were looking at costs in addition just to the items, but it's the same principle. You avoid having two different people, selecting and deselecting each other's items.
And it's good that,
and of course there is one.
it's good that you're
There is one other.
Oh, sorry, Kent. I was just going to say, it's good that your naming shows what should be in the back end, because obviously everything is in your front end.
Oh, yes. And that's for portability, because if you download the file from my webpage, you got it there and you can split it yourselves. I'm sure you're all capable of doing that. Now, why do I use ACIS as the prefix for these front-end tables? Well, if I used USIS, then to be able to see them, I would have to turn on my navigation option to show system objects. And I don't want to see all the MSys stuff and all that sort of stuff. Hence, I use ACIS as my prefix for application system rather than USIS for user system objects.
I like that. I did used to use a USIS a lot more than I do now, because people just didn't see them.
Well, and the problem is, like when I'm moving stuff to a new container, and quite often I have to move stuff to a new container because some of these applications are big and they get slow after a while. Hiding your system objects means that when you do an import of the objects from another database, you can just hit select all and you're not going to get the MSys. And then the only one you have to worry about is turning it on while you import USIS ribbons, which is a pain in the ass. So I usually get around that by actually having a copy of USIS ribbons with an ACIS prefix. So pull in, then change the name.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So, and typically with my application system tables, I'll just set their hidden property to make them hidden. And that way, I can unhide hidden objects and still not see. So I show my hidden objects. And typically that one would be hidden, though we don't want users seeing any of our table, any of the stuff in here anyway. But so getting back to here and looking what's going on here. All right, let's do a little look at what's happening behind this particular form. Now, there's our checkbox. So when I click on there, what have I got? I've got a transparent command button. And why have I got a transparent command button? Well, because if we look in the record source, we'll see we've got a left join here between room item and this item select, because there'll be a whole lot of these that don't have items in there. And this column here would just be null. And what we're doing here is we're going, okay, select this where I'm using the NZ function, so we get a false, as opposed to a true, except that there, why have I got, oh, because I've only got that, and they're all selected. Oh, yeah.
And that's NZ for us in America. Yeah, they might not have
America.
NZ.
Yeah, but those of us from Canada, it's still an NZ.
Yeah. You mean from Canada, because you're Canadians.
Yeah, there you go.
We're Australians from Australia, so you must be Canadians from Canada.
Perfect.
Is that how it works? Anyhow. So this button here, if we were to actually look at what it does, Is that font big enough for you, Crystal?
Yes, thank you, Kent.
All right, so we've got an item select function and we just pass it. This is the ID of the item that we want to select. And we do this. And if it's already selected, we delete it. If it's not in there, we add it. If it is in there, we delete it. So it's toggling.
And I see you
And as
put
you can
your
see here-
DBC changes, and that's something to point out that you do all the time. And it's important to point it out, I think, because it doesn't matter if you don't have the SQL Server backend, because it doesn't have any impact, even if you're just have an Access backend.
Yeah, and in this particular case, because the ACES table is in the front end, you don't actually need any of this stuff because it's an Access table. But if we decided we actually wanted to migrate that table to the back end and have it being a joining table between the user and the item, then we'd have to go through and do this. So I just have an MZ tools thing that, if I can remember the page that sticks that in there. So, and if you have a look at my MZ tools, team options, and we go to code library, and we've just got Shift Control R, and that'll paste in this line of code. Very handy MZ tools.
So my point about that comment, Kent, was to compliment you on using the DBC changes all the time.
Mm-hmm. And even with executing an SQL statement, we do this DB fail on error plus DBC changes. And that means that this is going to work with SQL Server. And given I've only got one client that still uses Access backends, but he does have 55 of them. And what else is interesting about this? Yes. Oh, now GDB set. Anyone know what I'm doing there? We've got a global variable for, usually that's current DB.
Yeah.
But DB engine 00. It just saves having to create a new. That's usually because I want it to be the current DB because there's reasons for that. I want one instance of the current DB.
Yeah, because if you use the DB engine, it doesn't actually refresh all the collections as current DB does.
Precisely. And there was Mike Wolf recently had an article about an issue with if you're not using current DB and something else tries to do it and then something else, and it all gets a bit messy. But because I've always pretty much got a pointer of my GDB to current DB, I've never had any issues with it.
Yeah.
So that's ensuring that I've always got an instance of current DB in play at any particular time. And one of the things is that when you open the application in the splash screen, the first thing I do is declare that GDB and open the back-end version table to make sure I've got a connection, and that's kind of maintained. And I was having to explain to somebody earlier today that it couldn't understand why he couldn't back up his SQL Server database when he'd closed all the forms in his front end, and why he still couldn't back up his SQL Server database. Well, thing is, in Access, when you close all of the forms that are bound to linked tables, your LACCDB will disappear if no one else has got it. But in SQL Server, with backend SQL Server, Access caches the connection and doesn't go away until you actually close the application. Did you know that? Oh, well, you do now.
Say that again. Say that again.
If the backend SQL Server, right now here, if my backend's Access, and I've got a backend with those tables, as soon as I close this form, I now no longer have a connection to the backend.
Okay.
And you'll see that the LACCDB file disappears.
Oh, disappears, right. Okay.
However, if the backend was SQL Server, I've still got a connection. Because Access caches that connection to SQL Server.
Access caches that connection whether it's being used or not.
That's right.
Okay.
So to release SQL Server, I have to actually close the application.
Well, do you
Now,
have
with
like
SQL
a
Server,
hidden form? Do you have a hidden form keeping that SQL Server connection persistent?
well, I do, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's a different problem.
If you close all your forms, it's still got a connection. So with SQL Server, you can actually back up the database while people are connected to it, but you cannot restore to it. And with my applications, generally what happens is that we're backing up the production database and restoring it to the test database and a development database. But if you're in the development environment and you've got the development front end open and connected to the development database, you can't restore the backup to the development database. You've got to close the application totally.
The SQL Server knows that somebody's
What else is in?
Yeah.
There's a few little odd things. I mean, I've done a lot of SQL Server migrations, and I still keep finding little things that are that'll catch you. Now, the other thing, well, let's look at some of the other stuff that's going on in here. Not that. Let's look at right. So in this particular instance, again, we have a button here that's adding the current item into the list. And what's kind of interesting is that the techniques for refreshing this checkbox differs between in a single form and in the continuous form. So if we have a look at the code here, this function here actually will refresh the details on the room form if it's open. So let's open the room form. if we go here and we select that, and we go back to our room form, we see that this box has already been refreshed. Now, this is another thing that's quite different between Access and SQL Server, is that Access is really good at refreshing data when it changes. SQL Server, not so much. With SQL Server, you often have to write code that will refresh or requery your forms if the data changes. Whereas Access will if the Access backend is Access, it will do it for you automatically. That's one of the other things I've noticed when migrating to SQL Server. It's one of the gotchas that the forms just don't refresh themselves. So adding a data into this form won't see it. So here, if I were to change that and save it somehow or other, I haven't got a save button. I'll move to another record and back. Oh, we need a king room. Was that right down the bottom? Right, so we've actually got that refreshed there, but we had to write code. Well, particularly if it's SQL Server, we'd have to write code to actually do that, because it won't see the change straight away. So that's what's going on. One of the things that needs to go on with the code there is to actually do that refresh. And when you're doing it in the subform, you notice what I have to do here is get the ID, do a requery of the form, and then go back to where I was.
What is this?
Now, Anders,
what does this code do? Because I see it doesn't say equals. So when you say a select item, select me, what does that do?
okay, that calls the procedure we were looking at before, which toggles which either adds or deletes that item from the.
Oh, you have an
select
item
list.
select. Oh, you have item select, and you have and then the item. Okay, got it. I didn't recognize it was a command.
Yeah, well, it's a sub, not a function, or it could be a function. I don't know. Was it a function? Whatever it does, it's just doing something. Now, the naming methodology I use, that's actually telling me it's the underscore, and the bit under the score after the underscore tells me what it's doing. Right. So if it's doing something,
okay,
it'll do that.
Okay, got it.
Whereas generally with a function that's returning a value, or particularly with a property get, it will tell me what it's returning.
Okay, the
So
naming
if it's-
convention confused me.
Yeah. So that's just telling me it's doing something
Fine.
rather than returning me.
Yeah, I'm used to seeing an equals
Yeah.
or something.
Well, see here, we've got an equals,
Myself again.
right? Because it's actually returning me a value telling me that it's a Boolean value, which means that it's selected or not.
Okay,
Right. So because that's an unbound checkbox, it's returning me to say whether it's checked or not, because it toggles it.
right.
If it's already checked, it comes back as unchecked. So it's reversing it, and that's setting the checkbox.
Got it.
And that's what it's doing on the single form, as opposed to on the continuous form, where we'd have to do a requery to get the new value, because it's not an unbound checkbox. It's a bound checkbox, but it's a checkbox which is not updatable.
Okay.
So you've got to use a different methodology in the continuous form is what to actually use in the single form.
Right.
Now, Anders wrote a really good little function that I use quite regularly in big, huge continuous forms that is kind of a requery and go back to where I was function, which is really quite useful. I use that a lot. But here it's just a simple, I'm just going back to where I am, and that's just a record set clone bookmark function, as you would. There it is. Like such. Now, I use .no match as opposed to, used to do it the other way, which was if some other property that says it was found, but the no match actually works better.
Good to know.
Can't remember why. What was the other if?
I always use no match too, Kent.
Yeah, I do too, and I'm not sure what else.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that I've just been worked out it was the best way of doing it years ago, and I can't remember why. But there was the other one about using me.dirty as opposed to do command, run command, AC command, save record. And there are sometimes things that's done in Access that leaves me a little bewildered. For example, this refresh all button up here on the ribbon. Now, for the life of me, sometimes working out how to emulate that particular functionality using requeries and refreshes, you just can't, because it does something particularly special.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
so
it also refreshes the table defs collection.
Is that what it does?
What are some of the other interesting things I came across trying to do this? Oh, yeah. And you'll notice that now, with most of my applications, I actually subclass the forms and the controls, which means that, for example, you know how you can have an on focus that changes the background color of the control, and you can use conditional formatting to do that. But I actually use a subclassing of the controls that does all that sort of stuff. The subclassing also does some interesting other things like I don't know, just stuff you want done consistently throughout the whole application, instead of having to put a what you would there, and I can't quite, is that format?
But doesn't that also give you a performance hit? I mean, because one thing I always do on combo boxes is I like drop it when, when they don't click on that little tiny area with the little drop down.
Oh, well, one thing I do with combo boxes is that the when the form loads, the combo boxes fully populate themselves. So you just have a throwaway long integer and you go long integer equals combo box dot list count, which means that when you drop the combo box, you don't have to keep clicking on it to get it to go all the way to the bottom. It's already populated, which is something that can be quite annoying with combo boxes if you don't do that. And
maybe quite annoying if you do.
I'm thinking it depends on how many items are in that combo box, whether there's a break point there where if you got 300 items, that may not be a good idea.
Yeah. So, but what I do, even if I'm not subclassing, I will do things like the before update event. We've got a generic before update, which just goes fill in the edit by and edit date. Yeah. And in the before update, it'll do things like that. So if there's an undo button and a save button, it'll enable those. And generally you've got a an after update that will disable them. Why don't I have an after update? I should have an after update.
So I see your before
Yeah.
update only populates the current username for the edit by, but on the record add, like if somebody's adding a record, you're not tracking that then?
Yeah, that's done
who
here.
added it?
Yeah, there's a before insert that does that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And there I'm just using the Windows username rather than a user ID, but you could use the user ID. However, and usually I have an after update, but I don't have saving buttons on these at the moment, but that's just because this is for a demo. So these particular controls here are just automatically updated. And in the on open event of the form, we do things like now this is something you could probably enlighten me about as well. I have had problems with sort orders and stuff being saved in forms when people have changed it and closed it and what have you. So I explicitly set the order by that I want for a form, and when it's opened, it says, if it's not that, change it. If it is, leave it alone. Because I was just having problems with sort orders being icky. And if you have a look at the forms properties.
Are you doing that on open or on load?
Does it make a difference?
Yeah.
I do it on the open.
Oh, well, open hasn't loaded the data yet. Well, and maybe it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I don't think it would matter if you're just setting the sort order. Could you do that same thing with filters? You've got a filter and the filter on load.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've had to do that on occasions too when users will put filters on and it gets saved with the form, and that can be quite annoying. But you've always got the argument with filters where sometimes you want the form to be filterable and sometimes you don't, in which case you'll actually, or you may not want you may open a form with a filter on it, and you may not want the user to be able to remove that filter, in which case you actually have to filter the record set, not the form itself.
Yeah.
So for instance here, if I were to double click on that, it takes me to this form and it goes to that particular record. But I've got all of the records here. It just goes straight to that one.
Yeah,
Now, the code I use to do that, whenever I build a form, I do them like this. I create a procedure that will open that form, and I can say whether it's optional or whether it's mandatory. Because if I want that form to filter every time to one particular item when I open it, and I want to use that filter, I might make that not optional. I've got to use it. And if I forget to do that when I'm calling this form, it reminds me because I'll get a compile error. But in this particular case, we just want to go to that record. So if the form's loaded, we set it to that and use the find me function. Now, otherwise, if it's not open, we do it this way. We open the form and send it an open arg. Now, I had previously been doing open the form and then using this, but that was just icky. Whereas the open arg just works so much more smoothly. So in the open event, which should be here somewhere, oh, can't live without MZ tools. If the open argument's numeric, then that's probably because we've got an idea we want to find. And that again is done in the open event rather than the load event for reasons which are not particularly well thought out.
Yeah, obviously, because what happens though is if you address the record set in the open argument, it actually does load it. Even though even though realistically that could be just in the load event, because you can't find something until it's loaded.
Yeah, you know what?
But it seems to work all right in the open event.
I just noticed the clock. We've gone well over our hour again. I find myself wrapped up in discussions and just realized we're 10 minutes over our hour. So to put out there, this is the kind of discussion that I find particularly useful. This kind of after the presentation follow-up discussion. So I'll give it to Kent as an alternative. You want to stay for another hour and just talk, or do you want to wrap it up? Because I think it depends a lot on. Nobody else is going to be here. I can probably.
Yeah, the time goes so fast. You said it's like an hour already, and I'm like, what?
No, it's
to me. Yeah, it's been so interesting.
Yeah, it's well over an hour, and I just happened to look at the clock, and of course realize that. But what I'm going to do is propose that if you want to do any final wrap-ups of your presentation, you should do that, and then we'll call it.
No, I've done all that. We're past that.
Okay, good. So what I'm going to propose is that we sort of schedule a session like this, where everybody just comes and talks about some of their favorite techniques or ways that they have found work better than others, and make it a group presentation with all volunteers. Is anybody interested in doing that?
This is brilliant. This is just great being able to talk with your peers, because, here the dog doesn't supply me with a whole lot of intellectual discussion. So,
yeah.
Well, it does help to have like a general presentation. Of course, Kent is really good to pick on, because I know he knows about SQL Server and all kinds of other stuff, which just doesn't come through right now. But you can hardly stump him.
Yeah, I agree. It needs to be focused, of course, but I'm just thinking something like this where we're free to just dig where the code takes us. Seems like an interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
way to
because
spend
there's
an
so many
hour.
discussions that we could have. Talking about naming conventions. To me, there's only one rule for naming conventions.
Oh,
Be
Kent,
consistent.
don't, yeah, okay, yeah. I was gonna say, don't go in.
Apart from that,
Don't
apart
even
from
go
that,
there.
But I mean, that's a discussion
so
in an environment where everybody is free to express their opinion without fear of being criticized. I think it's a worthwhile discussion. What are the pros and cons of the different?
It is
different approaches.
That just makes us better developers. I mean, just you learn. I'm gleaning a lot of knowledge just watching. I mean, you guys are. I would consider you guys MVPs, even though I've got a lot of programming experience in Microsoft Access. But iron sharpens iron, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good way to put it. So I'm gonna make that decision. I don't know when it'll be immediately, but sometime in the near future, I will put out a call. We'll announce a general topic like naming conventions or subclassing controls.
You want to get people hanging up and mad at each other, George?
I think if we all act mature, this ain't Twitter. We're not going to hang up on each other. I think we're all mature. I mean, I think
we get to pay our $8 and get a blue card.
Yeah, I think we're all mature enough to have a discussion without getting mad. Maybe I'll regret that later, but who knows?
If I do have actually, it's a real quick suggestion, and maybe I might open myself up for a presentation. I'm not quite ready for that yet, but this is something I found that I think would be useful. You know how you can group in Access? You can group your like, let's say you want to put all your functions, or you want to give it a category name. You know how you can go up into the nav bar and you can group them by name. So, okay, now I had a client that with this accounting package, they were storing some of their user-defined queries in there, and I talked them into, said, first of all, we can't really do it like that anymore because we've got there's over 60 plus modules. Let's put all the users' functions into one Access container. The problem was, and they had to be able to link to 4 SQL Server databases. Now, this is I'm giving you like, if this ever happens to you, what I was finding, I would put my categories, like this was like, for this database, this would be all these queries. For this database, it would be these queries, right? But what I was finding, when you did a rename, when you did because I put it in the Access ribbon that they could refresh the database connection to the company name that they wanted refreshed to. I was finding that when you close that Access and you go back in, the category names are gone. I had to write something custom to go in there, because even though Microsoft refreshes the links, it actually recreates, it gives it a new ID. And that's tied to the category ID, which means if you ever have that scenario where you've got multiple databases to connect to, and you have category names that are dependent on that, as soon as you relink the database, Microsoft creates another database link, giving it a new ID, and the category will disappear. So I had to write some logic to fix that. So I might show that at some point whenever I get brave enough to do a presentation.
Yeah,
but
for sure. Well, I'll be after you. I'll be after you sooner rather than later.
I mean, that whole concept of linking to multiple backends is worthy of a lengthy discussion, because there's just, I'm sure there are lots of things that we do that Access was never really quite designed to do. but we
Right.
managed
Never
to
intended to
do them anyway.
Right.
So actually, I am
So
getting a little bit nervous.
That would be,
I'm getting a little bit nervous about the time because I still have to edit this.
Oh, yeah.
And the longer it goes, the more time that's going to take. But thank you again, Kent.
I will
And
stop
thank you,
recording
Crystal
and
and
just-
Richard and everybody for participating too.
Yeah, excellent, Kent, and
Yeah, it was
great discussion.
Great discussion. It went kind of off topic in places, but I think we all got something useful out of it. So
Oh, and lastly, and then
Yeah.
I'll be, Crystal, thank you. One of the things I watched that you did a presentation on Microsoft add-ins, and you are right. The documentation on the web is few and far between. And I said, there's got to be a way. And I finally got some of my add-ins working, finally, after your presentation. So thank you very much.
that's good to hear. That's good to hear. So I am going to call it here at this point. I hate to because, you know, like I say, I get wrapped up and I want to know more, but I want to also respect your time. Appreciate the fact that you joined us here. So I will call it quits. I'll look forward to seeing you in January. I'm not sure quite how we'll work out the translation issue, but between us, we'll figure out a way to work with Spanish and English, and maybe with captions or subtitles. I understand there's a way to do that. So we'll see you all then. And again, thank you, everybody, and I'll see you next month.
See you, everybody.
Night.
thanks, George.
Thank you.